The child's boots were 3 sizes too big, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd already decided the world's fate. "Will you marry my daddy instead?" she asked the woman, clutching the fraudulent letter like a lifeline. Margaret Sullivan had counted every plank on the Clearwater Station platform. 73 weathered boards, each one marking another hour of hope, bleeding into Wyoming dust. The telegram in her pocket promised Jeremiah Hastings, rancher widower, seeking companionship. The station master's words still echoed, "No Hastings here, miss. Never was." Her carpet bag had become her pillow. Her remaining coins, a handful of copper promises that wouldn't buy passage back to Chicago. The townspeople whispered as they passed another mail-order bride, another broken contract, another woman learning that hope was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. But the child changed everything. Little boots splashed through puddles as she approached, corn silk hair escaping from uneven braids. "You got the sad look," the girl observed. "Miss Catherine says that's what happens when men lie in letters." Margaret straightened her spine. "I'm not sad anymore. Just deciding what comes next." "Good," the child said, grabbing Margaret's hand with startling authority. "'Cause I already decided. Daddy needs someone who stays. You look like someone who stays." The grip was small but fierce, pulling Margaret away from the station bench, where she'd counted 73 planks, and towards something she'd never planned for: a ranch house with peeling paint, a man with shoulders broad enough to carry grief, and a little girl who'd appointed herself matchmaker, with the confidence of someone who understood that love sometimes arrived on the wrong train. Samuel Knox stood on his porch like a man braced for another disappointment. His daughter ran ahead, dragging the stranger behind her. "Daddy, I brought someone better than the man in the letter." Margaret expected him to send her away immediately. Instead, his dark eyes studied her face, not her travel-worn dress or the dust on her shoes, but something deeper. Something that seemed to recognize the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been promised a place in the world and found only empty air. "Emma," he said to his daughter, voice carrying the weight of practiced patience, "you can't collect people like stray cats." "But she's not stray," Emma insisted. "She's exactly where she's supposed to be. I asked God for someone who'd make you stop looking so lonesome, and here she is." Samuel's jaw tightened. Margaret saw the war in his expression, between a man who'd stopped believing in answered prayers and a father who couldn't crush his daughter's faith. She made the choice for him. "I could use work until the next train," she said. "If you need extra hands." It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't desperation. It was an offering of labor in exchange for shelter, honest and clean. Samuel studied her for another long moment, then nodded once. "Room's small, works hard. Don't expect more than fair wages." Margaret hefted her bag. "Fair's more than I had an hour ago." Emma clapped her hands, already planning whatever 8-year-old schemes required a woman's presence. Samuel turned toward the house, but Margaret caught the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly, as if he'd been holding his breath longer than he'd realized. That first evening, as Margaret swept dust from the kitchen, and Emma chattered about chickens who had names and opinions, Samuel sat at the table mending leather with methodical precision. Not speaking, but listening to the sound of life moving through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. Margaret glanced up once to find him watching her hands work, quick, capable, unashamed of rough tasks. When their eyes met, he looked away quickly, but not before she caught something unexpected in his expression. Relief, as if he'd forgotten what it felt like when someone chose to stay without being asked to prove they wouldn't leave. The kitchen window faced west, and the last light painted everything gold. The scarred wooden table, Emma's drawings scattered across it. The careful distance Samuel maintained even as he remained in the same room. Margaret hung the dish towel on its hook and realized she'd stopped thinking about trains heading east. Not because of promises made or contracts signed, but because for the first time since stepping off that train, the silence didn't feel like waiting. It felt like home finding its voice again, one careful word at a time. Margaret woke to coughing that rattled the thin walls like winter wind through broken shutters. Emma's fever burned through the quilts, her small body shaking with chills that no amount of blankets could chase away. Samuel stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. His face carried the particular stillness of a man who learned to expect the worst from God's timing. "She's been like this since midnight," he said, not moving closer to the bed where Margaret smoothed damp hair from Emma's forehead. "Fetch the doctor," Margaret said without looking up. "Doc's in Cheyenne. Won't be back for a week." Margaret met his eyes, then saw the fear he was trying to bury beneath practical acceptance. She'd seen this look before on her mother's face when her youngest brother took sick on neighbors who'd learned that hoping too hard was just another way to invite heartbreak. Then we handle it ourselves. She sent Samuel for willow bark and honey while she prepared cool cloths and broth. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, calling for her mother in whispered fragments that made Samuel flinch each time. Margaret didn't ask about the woman who wasn't there. She just held Emma's hand and hummed hymns her own mother had sung during long nights of fever and fear. By the second day, Samuel had stopped leaving the house. He sat in the kitchen methodically cleaning his rifle, oiling leather, mending anything that didn't need mending, the restless, busy work of a man afraid to sit still with his thoughts. Margaret brought him coffee without being asked, their fingers brushing as she handed him the cup. "She's strong," Margaret said quietly. Samuel's hand stilled on the rifle. Her mother was strong too. The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of loss that shaped every decision, every careful distance he maintained. Margaret didn't offer empty comfort. She just nodded and went back to Emma's bedside, where she read from a worn Bible, not for the verses, but for the rhythm of her voice filling the silence. On the third night, Emma's fever broke. Samuel found Margaret asleep in the chair beside the bed, her hands still resting on Emma's forehead. He stood watching them for a long moment, his daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, and the woman who'd refused to leave despite having no obligation to stay. He covered Margaret with a quilt from his own bed, his movements careful not to wake her. When she stirred slightly, he froze, but she only settled deeper into the chair, one hand still instinctively reaching toward Emma. Samuel retreated to the kitchen, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he sat by the dying fire and let himself think about what it meant that Margaret had never once suggested sending for other help, never once implied that this wasn't her responsibility. She'd simply stayed and worked and worried as if Emma were her own child. By morning, Emma was sitting up asking for biscuits and wondering why everyone looked so tired. Margaret smiled and teased her about being dramatic, but Samuel caught the way her hands shook slightly as she prepared breakfast, the aftermath of 3 days spent holding vigil over someone else's child. "You should rest," he said when Emma wandered outside to check on the chickens. Margaret shook her head. "Work doesn't wait for rest." But Samuel had already decided. He took the wash basin from her hands and set it aside. "Work waits when I say it waits." For the first time since arriving, Margaret didn't argue. She let him guide her to the chair by the window, where morning light fell soft and warm across her face. Samuel brought her tea and sat across from her at the scarred wooden table. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than simple gratitude. Margaret studied his face, seeing something different in the way he looked at her now. Not like a hired hand or a temporary solution, but like someone who'd earned her place through more than just showing up. "She's easy to love," Margaret said simply. Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, she is." But his eyes never left Margaret's face, and in the quiet that followed, something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The beginning of trust built not on promises, but on presence, on the choice to stay, when staying was hard. That afternoon, Margaret found Samuel in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket with a letter half written on his knee. He looked up when she entered, not startled, but not entirely comfortable either. "Emma wanted to show you the new kittens," she said. But her eyes had already found the unfinished words, the careful script that spoke of a man unused to putting feelings into written form. Samuel folded the letter quickly. "They're in the back stall," but Margaret had seen enough to understand. The careful formation of her name at the top of the page. The false starts and crossed out lines of a man trying to explain something he barely understood himself. She didn't mention it. Instead, she admired the kittens with Emma laughed when one tried to climb her skirt, and pretended not to notice when Samuel slipped the letter into his pocket unfinished. That evening, as Emma played with her doll by the fire, Margaret and Samuel worked side by side preparing supper. Their movements had found a rhythm now, an easy choreography of shared tasks. When Margaret reached for the salt, Samuel was already handing it to her. When he needed the wash rag, she placed it within reach without looking up from her chopping. "You're different than I expected," Samuel said suddenly. Margaret glanced up. "How so?" He considered his words carefully. "Stronger. Most women wouldn't have stayed through the fever. Most women haven't been left at train stations by fictional fiancés." Samuel's mouth almost smiled at that. Almost. "Still, you could have left when the next train came through." Margaret set down her knife and really looked at him. "Could I?" The question surprised them both, because somewhere in the last week between fever watches in shared meals and the sound of Emma's laughter filling rooms that had been too quiet for too long, leaving had stopped being an option Margaret could seriously consider. Samuel met her gaze directly. "I don't know what I'd have done if you had." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a clear invitation to stay permanently. But it was honest raw in the way that only exhausted gratitude could be. And for Margaret, who'd spent months reading letters full of false promises from men who'd never existed, honesty was worth more than pretty words. That night, she wrote her own letter to her sister in Chicago, explaining that she wouldn't be coming home after all, that she'd found something here worth staying for. Not romance, not yet, but the rare gift of being needed in a way that felt like belonging. The riders came with the storm, their horses' hooves drumming against the rain-soaked earth like a heartbeat growing too fast. Margaret saw them first through the kitchen window, three men in dark coats moving with the purposeful stride of people who brought trouble as naturally as breathing. Samuel appeared at her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he recognized the lead rider. "Take Emma to her room," he said quietly. "Keep her there no matter what you hear." But Emma had already seen them, her face going pale, in the way children's faces do when they sense adult fear without understanding its source. "Daddy, go with Miss Margaret." Samuel said, his voice gentler than his expression. "Stay quiet." The men didn't knock. They pushed through the door like they owned the place, bringing rain and mud and the smell of whiskey-soaked leather. The leader was tall, well-dressed despite the weather, with cold eyes that cataloged everything in the room before settling on Samuel. "Knox," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You're late." Margaret pressed Emma closer to her side, feeling the child's small body trembling. From the doorway to the hall, she could see Samuel's shoulders set in a line that spoke of old fights and older debts. "I said next month, Garrett. Nothing's changed." Garrett smiled, and Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. She'd seen smiles like that before, on the faces of men who enjoyed other people's helplessness. "Everything's changed," Garrett said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Bank's calling in early. Full payment due in 2 weeks, or we take the ranch." The paper hit the kitchen table with a sound like a gunshot. Emma whimpered, and Margaret tightened her arms around the child, her mind racing through implications she didn't fully understand, but could feel in the sudden stillness of Samuel's body. "That's not the agreement we made," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. "Agreement changed when you started playing house with strangers." One of the other men said, his eyes sliding over Margaret in a way that made her skin crawl. "Makes a man unreliable." Samuel moved then fast enough that Margaret barely saw him cross the room before he had the man by the front of his coat slammed against the wall. "You watch your mouth in front of my daughter." "Samuel, don't," Margaret said sharply, not because she cared about the stranger's comfort, but because she recognized the trap being set. These men wanted him angry, wanted him to make mistakes. Garrett laughed. "Smart woman. You should listen to her, Knox. 2 weeks, full payment. Don't make us come back with the sheriff." They left as suddenly as they'd come, taking their menace with them, but leaving behind a silence that felt like held breath. Emma burst into tears the moment the door closed, and Margaret knelt to gather the child in her arms, while Samuel stood frozen by the table, staring at the paper like it might burst into flames. "Daddy owes them money," Emma asked through her sobs. "Hush now," Margaret said, but her eyes were on Samuel, watching him age 10 years in the space of a heartbeat. That night, after Emma finally fell asleep, Margaret found Samuel on the porch, staring out at land that might not be his much longer. She sat beside him on the wooden step, close enough to offer comfort without demanding conversation. "How much?" she asked finally. "More than I have." His voice was hollow, scraped raw by the kind of defeat that came from fighting the same battle too many times. "More than I can get in 2 weeks." Margaret waited, sensing there was more beneath the surface of his despair. "I borrowed against the ranch after Mary died." Samuel continued, the words coming slow and painful. "Medical bills, funeral costs, keeping food on the table, when I couldn't work for grief. Thought I had time to pay it back." "What changed?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. "You showed up. Garrett's been watching, waiting for any excuse to call in the debt early. Having a woman here, Emma, getting attached, he's using it against me. Says a man with distractions can't be trusted to honor his obligations." Margaret felt the trap closing around all of them, saw how her presence had become a weapon in someone else's hands. The practical thing would be to leave immediately, remove herself as a complication in Samuel's life. But the thought of abandoning Emma now, of walking away when the child had already lost so much, made her stomach turn. There has to be another way, she said. Like what, rob a bank, sell my soul to the devil? Samuel's voice cracked slightly. I've got nothing left to bargain with, Margaret. Nothing except this land, and they're taking that too. She studied his profile in the moonlight, seeing the weight of responsibility that had been grinding him down long before she arrived. A widowed father alone with a child who depended on him for everything, watching his world collapse, despite his best efforts to hold it together. An idea began to form, dangerous and desperate, but maybe, just maybe, possible. What if you weren't alone? She asked quietly. Samuel turned to look at her fully. What do you mean? Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. What if we were married? Really married, not just convenient. Would that change things? The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Samuel's eyes searched her face, looking for something she wasn't sure she was ready to show him. You don't know what you're saying, he said finally. I know exactly what I'm saying. Margaret turned to face him fully. I know you love your daughter more than your own life. I know you'd rather lose everything than see her hurt. And I know that sometimes the only way to fight an unfair system is to become something it can't easily destroy. Samuel's hands clenched into fists on his knees. I can't ask you to tie yourself to a sinking ship. You're not asking, I'm offering. Why the one? The question hung in the air between them, demanding honesty that might change everything, or break what little they'd built together. Margaret thought about Emma's laughter, about the way Samuel's presence made her feel safe, in a world that had shown her little kindness, about the strange peace she'd found in this house that had never been meant for her. Because leaving feels like dying, she said simply, and I'm tired of feeling dead. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw the exact instant when exhaustion won over pride, when desperate hope overcame careful caution. It wouldn't be a real marriage, he said carefully. Not at first. Just papers, legal protection. Margaret nodded, understanding. Just papers. But even as she said it, they both knew it was already more than that. Had been since the night she'd sat vigil over his daughter, since he'd covered her with his own quilt, since they'd begun moving around each other, like two people learning to share the same space without collision. 2 weeks, Samuel said, and Margaret heard the sound of a man gambling everything on one last desperate play. 2 weeks, she agreed, and sealed both their fates with those 2 words. The ceremony took place in the parlor of Mrs. Henley's boarding house, witnessed by Emma and the Methodist minister, who asked no uncomfortable questions about the haste of their union. Margaret wore her best blue dress, mended carefully where the train journey had torn the hem. Samuel's hands shook slightly as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that felt heavier than it should have. Emma stood between them, holding both their hands during the brief ceremony, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone whose plans had finally come to fruition. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, she clapped so enthusiastically that the boarding house cat fled the room. But the celebration was hollow. Margaret could see the strain around Samuel's eyes, the way he kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting Garrett's men to appear at any moment. The marriage certificate felt like a shield made of paper, fragile protection against forces that had been circling long before she'd arrived. That night, Margaret moved her few belongings into the room that had been Samuel's alone. They discussed the sleeping arrangements with careful practicality. She would take the bed, he would take the floor, until they could arrange something more permanent. But as she hung her dresses in the wardrobe that still smelled faintly of another woman's lavender water, the weight of what they'd done settled over her like a stone. You're having second thoughts, Samuel said from the doorway. Margaret turned, surprised by how easily he read her mood. Are you? Every minute since I said yes. Samuel entered the room, but kept his distance, hands shoved deep in his pockets. But that doesn't make it wrong. They stood in awkward silence, 2 virtual strangers who just promised to honor and cherish each other for better or worse. Margaret wondered what Mary had been like, whether she'd filled these silences with laughter or comfortable quiet, whether Samuel was comparing every moment to memories Margaret could never match. Tell me about her, Margaret said suddenly. Samuel's face went still. Why? Because she's part of this house, part of Emma, part of you. And if I'm going to be your wife, even just on paper, I need to understand what I'm stepping into. Samuel was quiet for so long, Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to the window, looking out at the dark outline of the mountains. She was brave, he said finally. Came west from Virginia with nothing but a trunk full of books and a head full of dreams about frontier life. Reality was harder than she expected, but she never complained. Not even when the winters nearly killed us both. Not even when, he stopped, his voice catching. When what, Messer, when the fever took the baby she carried before Emma. She blamed herself, thought she'd done something wrong. I told her it wasn't her fault, but she never quite believed me. Samuel's hands pressed against the window frame. She died believing she'd failed at the most important thing a woman could do. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, understanding now why Samuel carried such careful distance around his heart. You loved her very much. I thought love was enough, Samuel said quietly. Thought if I just worked hard enough, wanted it badly enough, I could keep her safe. But the frontier doesn't care about love. It takes what it wants and leaves you to figure out how to keep breathing. Margaret crossed the room until she stood beside him at the window. I'm not trying to replace her. I know. Samuel looked at her, then really looked, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression. But I'm terrified of losing you too. The admission hung between them raw and honest in a way that made Margaret's chest tight. She reached for his hand, found it warm and calloused and steady despite the tremor in his voice. You won't lose me the way you lost her, Margaret said. I'm not going anywhere. Samuel's fingers closed around hers. You can't promise that. No, Margaret agreed, but I can promise to fight. For this, for Emma, for whatever we're building together. 3 days after the wedding, Garrett returned with the sheriff and a handful of papers that made Margaret's blood run cold. Eviction notice, debt assessment, inventory of assets to be seized. The sheriff looked uncomfortable with the whole business, but legal was legal, and Garrett had the law on his side. You got 48 hours to vacate, the sheriff said, not meeting Samuel's eyes. I'm sorry, Knox. Wish there was another way. Margaret stood on the porch with Emma pressed against her side, watching Samuel's face, as everything he'd built crumbled around him. But instead of the defeat she expected, she saw something else in his expression, a cold, calculating anger that made her pulse quicken. Sam, she said quietly, a warning in her voice. But he was already moving, already reaching for decisions that would change everything. That night after Emma was asleep, Margaret found him in the barn with the horses saddled and his rifle cleaned and loaded. Morning, master. What are you doing? Samuel didn't look up from checking the ammunition. What I should have done months ago. Which is, Garrett keeps his money in a safe at his ranch. No banks, no records, just cash from all the ranches he's stolen over the years. Samuel's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, the tone of a man who'd moved beyond caring about consequences. I'm going to take back what he stole from me. Margaret's stomach dropped. Samuel, no, that's robbery. So is what he did to me. But if you get caught, then Emma will be an orphan, and you'll be free to find a better life somewhere else. Samuel finally looked at her, and Margaret saw the terrible logic in his eyes. If I do nothing, we lose everything anyway. At least this way, there's a chance. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to find some other solution that didn't involve her husband turning outlaw. But the numbers were brutal, undeniable. 48 hours and no miracle was coming to save them. Then I'm going with you, she said. Absolutely not. You need someone to watch your back, someone Garrett won't expect. Margaret stepped closer, her voice urgent. You need me, Samuel. I need you alive and taking care of Emma if this goes wrong. It won't go wrong. Samuel laughed harshly. How can you be so sure? Margaret met his eyes steadily. Because I finally have something worth fighting for. And I'll be damned if I'm going to lose it without a fight. For a moment, husband and wife stared at each other across the dim barn, weighing risks and love and the terrible mathematics of desperation. Then Samuel nodded once sharp and final. We leave at midnight. And Margaret, his voice was soft, almost gentle. If something happens to me out there, you take Emma and run. Don't look back. Don't try to be noble. Just run. Margaret reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palms. Nothing's going to happen to you. I won't let it. And in that moment, standing in the shadows with their futures balanced on the edge of a knife, they both finally understood what they'd been dancing around since the day she'd arrived at his door. This wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It was about saving each other. The Garrett Ranch sat in a valley bowl like a spider in its web, all dark windows and carefully tended prosperity built on other people's losses. Margaret crouched beside Samuel behind the ridgeline, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it would give them away. Below, 2 guards patrolled lazily, confident in their isolation. Safes in the main house, second-floor study. Samuel whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Guard rotation changes every 2 hours. We go in during the switch. Margaret nodded, checking the small revolver he'd insisted she carry. Her hands were steady despite the circumstances surprising. Since 3 months ago, her biggest concern had been whether her mail-order husband would be handsome. Now she was about to help rob the man who'd driven them to desperation. Remember, Samuel said, anything goes wrong. I run, Margaret finished. You've told me 6 times. But they both knew she wouldn't. Had known since the moment she'd insisted on coming that they were in this together now for better or worse, just like they'd promised in Mrs. Henley's parlor. The guards changed with predictable precision. Samuel and Margaret slipped down the hillside like shadows, using the storm clouds to mask their approach. The kitchen door was unlocked, arrogance that came from never expecting anyone to dare cross Garrett on his own land. Inside the house reeked of expensive tobacco and stolen comfort. Margaret followed Samuel up the back stairs, her soft-soled boots silent on the imported carpet. Every step felt like a heartbeat, every creak of the old house like thunder. The study door was locked, but Samuel had come prepared. The lockpicks worked like whispered prayers, and then they were inside facing a wall safe that looked more formidable than Samuel had described. How long? Margaret whispered. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Margaret positioned herself by the window while Samuel went to work on the safe, his fingers steady, despite everything riding on the outcome. Outside, the guards continued their lazy circuit, unaware that their boss's empire was being quietly dismantled 2 floors above their heads. The safe clicked open with a sound like salvation. Inside, stacks of cash and property deeds told the story of Garrett's systematic destruction of the valley's small ranchers. Samuel grabbed what belonged to him and left the rest. They were thieves by necessity, not by nature. That's when Margaret saw the rider approaching fast from the south lantern, swinging from his saddle. Sam, she hissed. He looked up from stuffing money into his coat, saw her expression, and moved to the window. The approaching rider was shouting something, and the guards below were responding, voices carrying clearly in the still air. Knox is here somewhere. Boss wants him alive. Margaret's blood turned to ice. They knew we were coming. Samuel's face was grim but unsurprised. Garrett's been 3 steps ahead of me since this started. Probably had men watching the house waiting to see what I'd do. Footsteps thundered up the main staircase. Samuel grabbed Margaret's hand, pulling her toward the back stairs, but it was too late. The study door burst open and Garrett stood there with 3 armed men, his smile cold as winter. Samuel Knox, Garrett said pleasantly. Caught red-handed at last. Samuel pushed Margaret behind him, his hand moving to his gun. But Margaret could see the mathematics 4 against 2, and she wasn't fool enough to think her small revolver would even the odds. Let her go, Samuel said quietly. Your fight's with me. Garrett laughed. Oh, but she's part of this now, isn't she? The blushing bride who thought she could save her husband's ranch with a marriage certificate? His eyes fixed on Margaret with predatory interest. Did he tell you about the clause in his loan agreement? Any criminal activity voids all payment arrangements, which means even if he'd somehow found the money, this little adventure just cost him everything. Margaret felt the trap closing around them, saw the careful way this had all been orchestrated. You wanted him to try this. Smart girl. Yes, I wanted him desperate enough to break the law. Gives me legal justification for everything that comes next. Garrett's smile widened. The ranch, the assets, even the pretty wife and adorable daughter. Wyoming law is very clear about what happens to the families of convicted felons. Samuel's gun was in his hand faster than thought, but Margaret was faster. She stepped forward, placing herself between the 2 men, her small revolver trained steadily on Garrett's chest. Here's what's going to happen, she said, her voice calm despite the chaos in her heart. Samuel and I are walking out of here. You're going to let us go, and you're going to tear up every paper you have on the Knox Ranch. Garrett's men shifted nervously, but he just laughed. And why would I do that? Margaret smiled, and it was her turn to look predatory. Because I have something you want more than the ranch. She pulled a folded paper from her dress pocket, the same paper Garrett had served Samuel with, but now it bore additional notations in careful feminine handwriting. While you boys were planning your little trap, I was reading the fine print of your loan agreements. Turns out charging 25% interest on distressed property loans violates territorial lending laws, which makes every contract you've signed in the last 5 years null and void. The color drained from Garrett's face. You're bluffing. Try me, Margaret said sweetly. I was a school teacher, Mr. Garrett. Reading legal documents is what educated women do when men underestimate us. She tilted her head. I've already sent copies to the Territorial Attorney General. One word from me, and your entire operation gets investigated." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Garrett nodded slowly, and Margaret saw something that looked almost like respect in his cold eyes. "You win this round, Mrs. Knox, but this isn't over." "Yes," Margaret said firmly, "it is." She and Samuel backed toward the door, weapons trained on men who suddenly seemed less certain of their advantage. In the hallway, they moved fast but careful, every step taking them closer to freedom or deeper into trouble. Outside, they ran for the horses like their lives depended on it, which they probably did. They rode hard through the night, not slowing until the ranch house came into view, with lamplight glowing warm in the windows, where Emma waited with the neighbor woman who'd agreed to watch her. In the kitchen, Samuel counted out the money they'd taken while Margaret brewed coffee with shaking hands. Enough to pay off the loan, enough to keep the ranch, enough to start over without the weight of Garrett's threats hanging over their future. "How did you know about the lending laws?" Samuel asked. Margaret smiled. "I didn't. But I was counting on Garrett not knowing them either, and being too proud to admit ignorance in front of his men." Samuel stared at her, and Margaret saw something new in his expression, not just gratitude or relief, but the beginning of genuine admiration. "You saved us," he said quietly. "We saved each other." Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Did you win?" Margaret looked at Samuel, saw him nod slightly, and opened her arms to the little girl who'd started this whole adventure by asking a stranger to marry her daddy. "We won, sweetheart. We all won." 6 months later, the Knox Ranch thrived under different management. Samuel had discovered that his wife's sharp mind was as valuable as her steady hands, and Margaret had learned that love could grow in the most unexpected soil when tended with patience and respect. They were really married now in all the ways that mattered, not because of desperate circumstances or legal necessity, but because they'd chosen each other through crisis and found something worth keeping on the other side. Emma grew taller and bolder, secure in the knowledge that the adults in her life would fight for her, would stay, would build something lasting from the pieces of what had been broken. She still wore boots too big for her feet, but now they were new boots bought with money honestly earned from land that belonged to them, free and clear. Margaret kept the forged letter from Jeremiah Hastings in her jewelry box, not as a reminder of deception, but as proof that sometimes the best things in life arrive by accident, disguised as disappointments. She'd been looking for a husband when she found a family, searching for security when she discovered purpose. On quiet evenings, she and Samuel would sit on the porch while Emma played in the dirt with her wooden dolls, and they would talk about the future they were building together. Not the future either of them had planned, but the one they'd chosen when choosing seemed impossible. And sometimes when the light was just right and Emma's laughter carried on the wind, Margaret would remember the woman who'd sat on that train platform, counting the planks beneath her feet, waiting for a life that was never coming. That woman had been looking for someone to save her. Instead, she'd found people worth saving, and in saving them, had saved herself. The frontier was still hard, still unforgiving, but it was also home now in all the ways that mattered. And when travelers passed the Knox Ranch, they saw what everyone hopes to find in the vast wilderness of the world, a place where love had put down roots and grown strong enough to weather any storm. Margaret Sullivan had gotten off the train looking for Jeremiah Hastings and found Samuel Knox instead. It was the best mistake she'd ever made, and the truest truth she'd ever lived. Some promises she'd learned were worth keeping, even when they were never actually made. And sometimes the best families were the ones you built from scratch, with faith and stubbornness, and the radical decision to stay when leaving would be easier. She'd waited 3 days at that station, but she'd found a lifetime's worth of reasons to stop waiting and start living instead.